Hi, everyone. This is a video on consistency and contradiction. And it's partly based on Chapter 9 of Bradley H. Dowden's Logical Reasoning. And he was kind enough to share his textbook online, and so I'm going to leave a link to it in the description below. Let's start with two examples. Are these statements inconsistent? Number one, Abraham Lincoln is my mother. Number two, Abraham Lincoln is your mother. So these two statements, Dowden says, are not inconsistent, at least internally, but they are inconsistent with the facts. Abraham Lincoln is nobody's mother, assuming that the name Abraham Lincoln refers to the person that we all have in mind. Next, how about these statements? Number one, everybody left the room. Number two, John is still in the room. It sounds like these two statements are inconsistent, but then the question is, what does John refer to? Is John a person? If so, then these statements are inconsistent. Is John an animal? Then maybe not. Or is John a teddy bear? Okay, so we have to clarify our names. We have to clarify our definitions to know how to answer this question. But let's define consistency as the following: when two or more statements are possibly true. And inconsistency as the following: when two or more statements can't all be true. And there are different senses of inconsistency, and you see them here. There's factually inconsistent, so we call this also externally inconsistent, or we're talking about external consistency here. And so this is when what you say or what you believe conflicts with the facts. So if you believe that unicorns exist, then you've got a factually inconsistent belief. Next, we have inconsistent with expectations, and that just means you're surprised about something. You believe something to be the case, and you got surprised. Okay, we use that as a common way of using this term. Next one is logically inconsistent. So we also call this internal consistency. And so this is, as the author says, when the very meaning of the words make something inconsistent. So this is when your very own beliefs even are inconsistent with one another. Now, there's another sense of inconsistency that Dowden doesn't mention, but I assume he probably includes it in one of the categories above, and that is practically inconsistent. So when your words don't match your behavior, maybe you say there are no objective moral values, like morality is relative, but then you act as if there are. Okay, that would be an example of being practically inconsistent. As an example of inconsistency, Dowden mentions the following philosophical conundrum, which some philosophers of religion use to show the inconsistency of free will and divine foreknowledge. To sum up this problem, it looks like this with two statements. Number one, God knows the future. And number two, we have free will. So some philosophers think that these two statements are inconsistent. They're incompatible. You can't believe both of them. So to show why that's true, I've gone and pulled this version of the argument against the compatibility of foreknowledge and free will from a source. Actually, the source is a book called Reason and Religious Belief. And it goes into more detail here to show what it looks like to hold these two beliefs and why philosophers sometimes think they're inconsistent. Number one, it is, and this is organized in terms of an argument. You've got premise, conclusion. Number one, it is now true that Clarence, just some guy we made up, imaginary fellow, he will have a cheese omelet for breakfast tomorrow. Number two, it is impossible that God should at any time believe what is false or fail to believe anything which is true. That's just the meaning of omniscience. Number three, God has always believed that Clarence will have a cheese omelet tomorrow. That's a conclusion that follows from premises 1 and 2. Number four, if God has always believed a certain thing, it is not in anyone's power to bring it about that God has not always believed that thing. And so that's just stating that the past is unalterable. Number five, therefore, it is not in Clarence's power to bring it about that God has not always believed that he would have a cheese omelet for breakfast. 6, it is not possible for it to be true both that God has always believed that Clarence would have a cheese omelet for breakfast and that he does not, in fact, have one. And 7, therefore, it is not in Clarence's power to refrain from having a cheese omelet for breakfast tomorrow. In other words, there's no free will. So this is the argument. Can you think of a way to resolve the alleged inconsistency? Go ahead and pause the video and just reflect on that, wrestle with it, and see if you can come up with the answer. Okay, I hope you've had a second to do that. And let me just pose this as a possibility. The argument seems to assume that God is in time. So if you go back through the premises, you see that there's an assumption being made that God is in time and believes things about the future. What is future to him? But it's possible that God only believes things in a timeless way. And so then this apparent inconsistency would be resolved. Okay, so that's an interesting way, a fun way of thinking about it. Let's move on. The difference between contradictory and inconsistent statements. So contradictory statements, when you have a pair of contradictory statements, one has to be true and one has to be false. When you have a pair of inconsistent statements, they could both be false. And here are some examples. Number one, the house is all green. And number two, the house is not all green. Okay, so one of these statements has to be true and one has to be false. The next pair, the house is all green and the house is all blue. These are inconsistent, but they could also both be, they could be false, right? So these aren't contradictory necessarily in the technical sense that Dowden wants to use that term. And so again, he mentions in the book that we often in normal common speak, we use the words contradictory and inconsistent as synonyms, but in the technical philosophical sense, there are differences as pointed out here. Some statements are inconsistent with themselves and are called self-contradictory. For example, there are no absolute truths. Or, and I like this one, no English sentence is longer than 7 words. Also, we have oxymorons, contradictions in terms. When you have two terms that communicate contradictory ideas such as square circle or jumbo shrimp. And then there's the term contrary, which again is another synonym for inconsistency. Okay, I'm going to skip down here through this handout and get to strategies that he proposes for resolving inconsistencies. Dowden describes an example of moral inconsistency in the following scenario. Number one, okay, so this is a moral rule. People ought to keep their promises to their family. And here's another moral rule. You shouldn't do anything that is likely to hurt innocent people. So here you have an apparent inconsistency. So, and he uses this example. What if your father asks you to fulfill your promise to him by helping him with his summer project to build a deadly trap for burglars? So you might find yourself conflicted here because you have this promise that you want to keep, but you don't want to do anything that is likely to hurt innocent people. And in this scenario, you could endanger the neighborhood children who might wander onto your property. And so he's saying that you can actually revise the first rule in order to resolve the contradiction. For example, you could say people ought to keep their promises to their family unless this requires hurting innocent people. And now you resolve the inconsistency. Another one here, another rule, number one, you shouldn't lie to your mother. And the second rule, you shouldn't do anything that could harm your mother. So if you hold both of these and you want to follow both of these, you might find yourself in a situation in which, say, your mother is in a fragile condition, she's in the hospital, and any sort of discomfort or disturbance might cause her health to go downhill quickly. And so the doctor or other family members advise you, please don't tell her that her condition is terminal or something like that. And so when your mother asks you, how am I doing? And what you're faced with the dilemma, should I lie or should I not, especially when you don't want to do anything that could harm your mother? Well, you could revise the first rule here too. You could just say, yes, I shouldn't lie to my mother unless it would harm her. And now you have two rules that are consistent. So that's one strategy for working through inconsistencies. So I want to just end up here with the question, why does consistency matter at all? Why is it important? Well, Aristotle says that we are rational animals, and this is just illustrated by asking this very question, the question why? By using words, by engaging in conversation, by studying the world, we assume certain principles of logic, like the principle of non-contradiction. Something can't be A and not A at the same time. And so why does it matter? It matters because the denial of it is an impossibility. If you found this video helpful, go ahead and hit like down below.